of you ever had the experience of walking on stage and having people clap for you? Really good. Come on in, have a seat, so thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Ian. There's Ian Warren, everyone. Thank you all so much. It's really, really wonderful to have you all here. So I just want to give a couple thank yous. Thank you to the Henry for hosting us. They've been really wonderful hosts and very supportive. Ian Warren, who you just saw, as technical assistants in here. He's been wonderful. I want to thank Nina Bezichnik and Ryan Helterbrand for helping us conceive of this evening. We're going to have a discussion after the performance. I'm very excited about it. Every time Ryan talks about Claude Cahun, I learn something new. I feel inspired. I also want to thank collaborators on this piece, Jeffrey Azevedo, my partner in crime, and co-choreographer Eliza Delpany-Monley. Yeah. And then our three wonderful performers who you'll meet in a moment, Benya Abrams, Sierra Hendricks, and Grace Ford. I also just wanted to give a little background on this piece. Many of you know the story kind of behind this work, but for those that don't, about 5 years ago, I started receiving letters from an anonymous street artist who refers to themselves as AO. The letters were instructions for performance and were titled as temporary solutions. In February On the Boards, we created an evening-length performance that was a collection of those temporary solutions. We titled the piece, Awaiting Oblivion, Temporary Solutions for Surviving the Dystopian Future We Find Ourselves Within at Present. After the show closed, we continued to receive instructions from AO for performance. And what you're going to see tonight is temporary solution number 1945, part B, the Perpetual Insurrection of Claude Cahun. And this is the letter with those instructions. April 16, 2017. Tim, as these solutions are temporary, expected to fade, they must continue. Of course, it's your choice to continue to fulfill my instructions or not. This is temporary solution number 1945, part B, the Perpetual Insurrection of Claude Cahun, a continuation. I met Claude Cahun when I needed her most, when my walls were soon to be bulldozed, soon to no longer be any semblance of mine. I met her at a potluck party through a sassy academic with a red beard and a small pile of empty beer cans at his feet. It was one of those, potluck parties, at one of those, co-op type houses, with one of those, far too few magical, steadfast, hippie landlords refusing to succumb, resisting at all costs the impending condo next door, the attempted acquisition of the land beneath the old house he tries to keep cheap for queers and weirdos, students and artists, social workers, academics, activists, who speak of his glory at said potlucks. I heard he went to a proposed land use meeting and literally played Pave Paradise and put up a parking lot on a boombox. A tape player boombox, of course, because he religiously maintained his anti-CD stance since 1984. At this potluck, at this co-op type house, owned by one of those too few magical, steadfast hippie landlords, I met Claude Cahun. Through a sassy academic with a red beard and a small pile of empty beer cans at his feet. He was one of those, academics, who I usually ignored at these types of potlucks, at these types of co-op type houses. Though the more I listened to him, I began to understand him as an academic monastically devoted to unearthing the forgotten patron saints of the avant-garde. I began to understand him as an academic who obsessively writes all day and also dances at the clubs that stay open past sunrise. I decided he was maybe all right, so I joined the small group of loyal, almost grade school-style storytime listeners convened around him. He spoke of Claude Cahun like a sidewalk preacher. He spoke of Claude Cahun, her hand on a revolver, as she stood on a hillside plotting the assassination of Nazi officers who were commanding the fleet that had just occupied her little island town that she moved to with her lover Malherbe. Ryan spoke of her desire to die, to kill the Nazi officers, and to kill herself. He spoke of her struggle with depression, hopelessness, suicidal ideation. He spoke of her resolve to lower the weapon and mount tactics of psychological and semiotic sabotage, to mount a poetic resistance to destroy the troops' morale. Upon this pronouncement, the revelation of another suicidal ideated heroine, I ran up to his room, opened his computer, and downloaded a copy of the current draft of his thesis onto a thumb drive. The dissertation is titled, A Multiple Always, The Perpetual Insurrection of Claude Cahun. I probably could have asked him for it. But I sometimes have very intense social anxiety, and I don't trust anyone. I rode home as quickly as I could, read the first chapter, then sent Ryan a note. It said, I think you've uncovered an almost forgotten pillar of poetic resistance. Thank you. Also, I assumed all academics were pompous elitists. That was incorrect. I apologize. I also apologize for stealing your paper. I needed it, though. He sent me back a picture of her with a note on the back, reading, post this picture on your wall, soon to be bulldozed, soon to no longer be any semblance of yours. I sent him back a picture of Claude Cahun's face, wheat-pasted to boarded-up doors and windows, with Perpetual Insurrection in construction zone fluorescent orange across the front. I sent him these instructions for performance that I'm sending to you now. You will fulfill them together. Temporary solution number 1945, Part B, The Perpetual Insurrection of Claude Cahun. Instructions for performance. Number 1, perform these sections of Ryan's dissertation outlined below to spread the gospel of Claude Cahun like a sidewalk preacher. Or rather, spread the gospel of Claude Cahun like the most fervent, flickered karaokeist. 2, spread the gospel with a chorus of voices, another, a multiple always. 3, dance the praise ritual of our all but lost patron saint. 4, reclaim the attempted erasure of her psychological and semiotic sabotage. Because the Nazis did not succeed in burning everything, because they will, if allowed, in all their modern forms again attempt to burn the many hard-fought histories and expressions held in molded journals, bound letter correspondences, and unfinished lines on sketch paper. 5, continue the dialogue. Construct a queered classroom for the surreal weapons.
A Multiple Always, The Perpetual Insurrection of Claude Cahun. Abstract. This work explores the long-neglected political work of Claude Cahun, a French surrealist writer and activist most famously known as an avant-garde photographer active in the 1920s, but who later formed a powerful anti-Nazi resistance movement on the Channel Island of Jersey in the 1940s with her collaborator Suzanne Malherbe, dubbing themselves the Nameless Soldiers. They fought the Nazis with what they called Surrealist weapons of chance, mounting a devastating campaign against the German soldiers that sought to confuse and demoralize them, fomenting revolt in the Nazi camp. I argue that Cahun's most important contribution to our present moment lies in her radical rethinking of the place of the artist and avant-garde aesthetics in revolutionary political struggles, a theme that runs throughout her literary work of the 1920s, her political work with the Surrealists in the 1930s, and her resistance activities against the Nazis during the 1940s. This work, then, is oriented around two central questions. What can be the role of the artist in radical political struggles? And what part might an avant-garde aesthetic have to play in them? Chapter 3, The Perpetual Insurrection, page 89, paragraph 2, sentence 1. Although Cahun remained active in the promotion of Surrealism throughout the 1930s, the worsening ideological climate, the mounting of bellicose tensions, anti-Semitism, what she felt as the physical need to leave Paris, which fatigued her, contributed to her and Malherbe's decision to leave Paris in 1938 and install themselves definitively on the Channel Island of Jersey.
Chapter 4, The Nameless Conspiracy, page 93, paragraph 1, sentence 3. After the invasion of Paris by the German forces in June 1940, Winston Churchill was being pressed for a decision on the Channel Islands. They were much closer to France than to England and were of relatively little tactical value. Churchill and his War Council became the decision on the 15th of June to demilitarize the Channel Islands, including Jersey, and privately declare them open islands. All of Jersey had been turned over to the Nazis wholesale without the firing of a single shot. The islanders were faced with a choice. They could ready themselves for the official evacuation boats that were set sail for England, or they could stay on Jersey and take their chances. Cahun and Malherbe did not hesitate. When they were faced with the choice of evacuation, they deliberately decided to stay and stand their ground.
Chapter 4, The Nameless Conspiracy, page 96, paragraph 2, sentence 1. Although Cahun would eventually be galvanized by the unilateral impositions of the Nazis into forming a powerful resistance movement against them, her initial reaction was one of depression and despair. In a letter written after the war, she records her near constant feelings of suicidal ideation at this time, the nauseating emotional oscillation between rage at the Nazis and a desire to kill herself that seemed, by contrast, agreeable if not favorable. Malherbe was her saving grace, providing her with the emotional support to keep from sinking into the despair of my powerlessness. Bolstered by Malherbe's encouragement to not capitulate internally or emotionally to the Nazis, Cahun's feelings of despair quickly transformed into a kind of manic anger. Several weeks after the invasion of Jersey, Cahun flew to the attic in search of a pair of revolvers given to her by her uncle. There, she diligently practiced firing her revolvers, preparing for a direct, perhaps suicidal, confrontation with the Nazi forces. A little later, a meeting of Nazi officers was to take place in the military cemetery that bordered La Roquette, and Cahun saw that the opportunity to shoot a German, the commandant of the island, was practically in my scope. She found the superhuman discipline to resist firing Schwab's revolver in an act that would have only been an isolated one, a useless figure of provocation. Killing the officer would have been a sure death sentence for herself, and almost certainly for Malherbe. It certainly would not have ended the occupation of Jersey. Cahun returned to an idea she had thought of long ago. Poets, she had said, act in their own way on the sensibility of people. Their attacks are more devious, but their most oblique blows are sometimes fatal. A head-on confrontation with the Nazis was certainly out of the question. What oblique strategies, what nameless weapons could she find instead to defeat them? Chapter 4, The Nameless Conspiracy, page 99, paragraph 2, sentence 1. Transmuting her despair into fury, turning her suicidal self-aggression into an aggressive pacifism aimed at the Nazi invaders, Cahun began her first campaign of anti-fascist propaganda, engaging herself, as she would later say, in the way of revolutionary defeatism. Cahun realized that the only way to influence the actions of the Nazi officers would be to make them doubt the validity of the present war, to force them to bring out their own ambivalences towards Hitler's government, to bring down to earth their delusions about the nature of a war in which they and their compatriots were being sacrificed by an abusive regime. Cahun had the beginnings of a resistance project. She started to scroll the phrase "un ende," without end, on cartons of cigarettes, packages, pieces of wood, facades, and walls, repeating it over and over in the most public and heavily trafficked parts of the island, to begin to plant doubts in the occupiers' minds. Later, she would inscribe the phrase and its cousin, "Nieder mit Krieg," down with war, on coins she had loaded into machines at the amusement park in Saint-Hélier, knowing that the German soldiers would get their change, and more than they bargained for.
Chapter 4, The Nameless Conspiracy, page 100, paragraph 2, sentence 2. Shortly after the war, Cahun described the genesis of her news service to a reporter for the Jersey Evening Post. It all started in 1940 in a small way and grew as time went on. We always listened to the BBC and any other news we could get, which was not tainted by the Nazi propaganda, and it made us perfectly sick to hear the news put out by Radio Paris. So we decided to run a news service of our own for the benefit of the German troops. Working with Malherbe, she began to distribute small tracts to the soldiers that kept them appraised of Allied victories and Nazi defeats. John Lewis, Cahun and Malherbe's doctor on Jersey, records the story.
Suddenly, soldiers would find in their pockets a small roll of fine paper, about the size of a cigarette, on which was typewritten, in good German, a resume of the last 4 days' news. This, of course, was circulated with avidity from hand to hand, and the occupying troops soon came to rely upon it as the only source of absolutely reliable information about the progress of the war. About 20 copies were made of each newsletter, and after they had rolled them, they cycled into town where they mingled with groups outside shops or other places where troops and civilians congregated. There, very skillfully and unostentatiously, they popped their little rolls into knapsacks and unsuspecting pockets. Chapter 4, The Nameless Conspiracy, page 104, paragraph 3, sentence 1. Throughout 1941 and into the beginning of 1942, one can chart a gradual evolution and intensification in Cahun and Malherbe's approach to their project of active resistance, culminating in the creation of an entire underground movement, the Soldier Without a Name and His Comrades. The language of their tracts at this time is strident and forceful, inciting the common soldiery to join them. One tract in particular links Cahun's original Un Ende project to this new instantiation of it, daring the soldiers to go without their commanders and the emotional and physical impositions that have been unilaterally forced upon them.
Comrades of the Navy, soldiers and workers, spread our newspaper in the harbor, spread it in France, spread it in Belgium, spread it in Holland, spread it in Denmark, spread it in Norway, spread it in Germany. Take them with you on holiday. Read it every week. Without the Kriegsmarine, without the Luftwaffe, without the Wehrmacht, the weak of the without. Take on the without.
Emphasizing the without, leadership, their army, their navy, their air force, daring them to desert, if even for a week, to corral this without, and to take it on as their own personal project, to spread it among themselves, among others, among the public, internationally. The seeds for the soldier without a name were sown. The only way to fight a deranged or dangerous structuration of individual emotion and imagination, Cahun realized, was to take the battle there. She had once written that the secret of poetry lies in the way it can cut through and short-circuit the defenses of its readers, slipping through the back door of their sensibility and engaging them directly on the terrain of their own subjectivity. Executing in these maneuvers a kind of psychological and semiotic sabotage. Poetry's most indirect, magical paths, its most illogical, emotional shortcuts, its most oblique blows, she had written, were oftentimes its most fatal. Pitting the poetry of metamorphosis against the brutality of historicity, Cahun armed herself with these weapons of writing in a surrealist circumstance. Fighting for the Germans against Nazi Germany in a little village 100% occupied. Fighting without literature, all papers, all poems, all pictures to be destroyed, as soon as they are seen, as soon as they are read. She tells us that she fought not only for the Germans against Nazi Germany, but for the entire rainbow of values, ranging from ultra-romantic black to iron red to white, making submerged values reappear and surge forth, breaking through the Nazis' interior defenses, attempting always to provoke this perpetual insurrection of sensibility.
Chapter 5, The Nameless Weapon, page 121, paragraph 1, sentence 6. In addition to her news service and constant pamphleting, Cahun also began creating site-specific installations that use the particular mise-en-scène of each location to further spread the gospel of the Nameless Soldiers. In a church frequented by the German soldiers, Cahun hung this banner over its altar. Jesus is great, but Hitler is greater. For Jesus died for the people, but people are dying for Hitler. Placed overnight, this banner was the first thing to greet the soldier penitents one Sunday morning. Was this the prelude to a sermon? Was it the sermon itself? And if it wasn't, how could the real sermon be seen as anything other than its own piece of propaganda?
Chapter 6, The Spiritual Sharpshooters of Jersey, page 144, paragraph 1, sentence 4. The Nameless Soldiers continued their work for 4 years before Cahun and Malherbe were arrested by the Gestapo and forced into one of the Nazi-controlled prisons. Being exposed as the Nameless Soldiers did not deter Cahun and Malherbe from continuing their work. On the contrary, it only spurred them further on. Being unmasked, Cahun wrote, we could use more direct methods. We continued our propaganda close to the Germans for the overthrow of the Nazi regime and capitulation without combat. It was also in prison that Cahun realized the true impact of her resistance work, meeting the islanders and soldiers who had been influenced by her propaganda, sometimes even to the point of desertion. Objective facts, she later reflected, have proved that these secret, contagious words, ours, have put the refusal in the mouths of sheep, pushed back the butchers. My phantom, she continued, amazed, has incarnated itself in men unknown to us. Even in the depths of prison, the nameless conspiracy soldiered on. Nothing left for us but to brave, Cahun wrote Malherbe while awaiting trial. To concentrate on steady and beloved ideas in order to forget this painful present. Patience, when practiced long enough, becomes a kind of genius. On the same night the two were arrested, agents of the Gestapo raided their farm, carting away their immaculate library, burning an enormous quantity of Cahun's literary and photographic work. The Nazi officer who personally supervised the operation recorded the plunder in his diary.
There are very few Jews in the island. The two Jewish women who have just been arrested belong to an unpleasant category. These women had long been circulating leaflets urging German soldiers to shoot their officers. At last, they were tracked down. A search of the house, full of ugly cubist paintings, brought to light a quantity of pornographic material of an especially revolting nature. One woman had had her head shaved and had thus been photographed in the nude from every angle. Thereafter, she had worn men's clothes. I declined with distaste the loan of a book on cubism. At the moment, pronouncement of sentence is being postponed. Normally, on the charge of inciting the troops to rebellion, they could be condemned to death.
Allowing his subordinates to either burn or loot the remaining contents of La Roquez, the officer wiped out one of the most important archives in the history of Surrealism, with countless pictures, paintings, writings, and letters destroyed at a single stroke. While some of Cahun's works survived the indiscriminate destruction of her unpublished theoretical writings and photographic works, counts as one of the great tragedies in the history of the avant-garde.
Chapter 6, The Spiritual Sharpshooters of Jersey. Page 149, paragraph 2, sentence 1. The trial of Cahun and Malherbe produced a unanimous vote of guilty. Sorensen, the head prosecutor, returned shortly after the reading of their statement with his verdict, one that reflected his own sense of astonishment and consternation toward the Nameless Soldiers. Their offenses were not merely personal or moral, he began, but constituted a political crime of an absolutely singular kind. You are franc-tireurs, he continued, snipers, sharpshooters, even though you use spiritual arms instead of firearms. It is indeed a most serious crime. With firearms, one knows at once what damage has been done. But with spiritual arms, one cannot tell how far-reaching it may be. For Cahun, Sorensen's indictment was the most powerful and important confirmations of her resistance work possible. The nameless weapons had been so effective, they had damaged the morale of the German troops island-wide, sent the officers reeling, spread panic through the ranks. Sorensen was obliged to hand down the War Council sentence. For propaganda undermining the morale of the German forces, we were sentenced to death. And for listening to the BBC and concealing their camera and revolver, an additional 6 years and 9 months. Rising to give a final statement, Cahun made the tribunal burst out laughing by her simulated naivete. Are we to do the 9 months and 6 years before or after we are shot?
Chapter 6, The Spiritual Sharpshooters of Jersey. Page 154, paragraph 2, sentence 1. On May 8th, 1945, just 15 minutes before Churchill's famous "This is your victory" speech, the call came down from the Nazi leadership to release the two resistants. They were met at the prison gates by a friend who accompanied them back to what remained of their farm. They took in the scene, saw the destruction, grieved the looting, attempted to chase down what remained of their belongings, of their pictures, of their lives. They were met with scant success. So much was gone. So much had to be rebuilt. But Cahun, valuing above all her freedom, stood there, taking it all in, knowing what she had done.
which she had almost died for, which she had survived. At this moment of maximum intensity, a thought passed through her. Here, in the ruined farm, I am free. The nameless conspiracy had succeeded. The nameless soldiers had broken through the emotional defenses of the invaders, undermining them at their very core. Putting a brake on the destruction, the nameless weapons had, again and again, found their marks. Moreover, she was alive, and so was Suzanne. And, a crowning achievement, the Nazi prosecutor at her trial had called her a franc tireur of the mind, a sharpshooter whose spiritual weaponry had done an incalculable amount of damage to the Nazis on Jersey, and the imaginary on which they depended, inciting the German soldiers to inner desertion and outer rebellion. While she had created the nameless soldier to be a life-giving symbol for the Nazis, they had gifted her one back, a symbol that encapsulated for her all that she had accomplished during her years of active resistance. Transfigured, even in their eyes, Cahun had become the spiritual sharpshooter of Jersey. And Ryan Helterbrand.
Okay, are these working?
Hello? Hi. Oh God, that's what I sound like? Okay, I should go with that. Hi.
Okay, wow, that was great. We're going to transition to something that's of a different tone.
A little less physical.
Yeah. Chill here.
I'm sweating, haven't seen that.
I wanted to start by just thanking Tim and Jeffrey and Ryan for giving me the opportunity to learn a lot more about the vibrant life and contributions of Claude Cahun and her poetic resistance on the occasion of this performance and this conversation. Like Tim mentioned, every time, Ryan and I have been talking and meeting for a couple of months now on several occasions, and I always learn something new, so it's been a real gift to me. And I'm certainly no expert on modernism, literature, or the avant-garde. That's going to be Ryan's contribution tonight. I'm just going to be kind of the prod to move us along in our discovery together of Claude Cahun and her life. And I really only knew Cahun through her self-portraits, which we'll start seeing behind us, that she was doing throughout her life. So these self-portraits are amazing contributions to the history of photography and foreground, like this whole idea we've been kind of learning about through the performance of this fluidity of self, this sort of malleability, transformative possibility of our subjectivity. But through the performance, we've just learned that there's like so much more to Cahun's contribution to art, intellectual life, and revolutionary activity that goes beyond her photographs. So tonight, what we're going to talk with Ryan about is this larger contribution. What we've just sort of, the genesis of her thinking of being a multiple always, that's going to be a consistent theme, and her belief in the liberatory possibilities of art and literature to catalyze transformation and metamorphosis of the self and, by extension, society. And this quote is just amazing. There's so many in this dissertation that we've already heard, but just to restate it and set the stage, a work of art or piece of writing has the potential to make people recognize and critique their current structure of subjectivity, and I don't think that's something that we could ever state enough. So what we're going to do is move a little we're going to move chronologically to trace the genesis of Cahun's ideas from the 20s through to the work in the 40s on the island of Jersey. So it'll sort of set the stage for her thinking and how it evolved. And the intent is to generate a more complex understanding of Cahun and her work, and to more broadly to reclaim her story and her history as this queer heroine from the past to whom we might turn to as a model, inspiration in our contemporary times. So with that, I think it's important to start with this very perhaps personal question, Ryan, of how you arrived at Cahun. What was it in her history, her work that was like, I want to devote all of this time and research and write a dissertation on her?
So I was in a class with Herbert Blau, who some people might remember as being a fabulous professor who passed away several years back. And I forget what I was reading. There was one little quote from her, and she's full of them, wonderful quotes. And it was something like, I'm the worker bee of subjectivity. I'm always collecting pollen and turning it into honey, turning it into new things. And just that one little line struck with me, or stayed with me, struck me and stayed with me. And then it was time for the dissertation, and as you can imagine, I was flipping out, trying to figure out what to write a book about. And I was like, well, let's turn to Cahun, but I knew nothing beyond the photographs. I knew pretty much what he said you had known about her. And then I started reading a little more, and learning a little bit of French to see what was going on, and realized that she fought, pardon the French, she fought the fucking Nazis.
Yes.
Right? I know! And from that moment on, I was like, I'm completely obsessed. You know, and that was probably 3 years ago. And then I really taught myself French that summer to do the translations and stuff like that, and I was just absolutely obsessed. To answer your question, why she has been so, what excited me about her is I feel like she's a hero for the present moment. And at the time I was writing and thinking about this work, the Nazis actually hadn't come back yet. You know what I mean? But it was on the horizon. And then now they're back. So it's literally. So it seems very timely, unfortunately, for sure.
And so her strategies are rooted in this poetic resistance and this sort of possibility for the self to reconfigure their internal understandings of themselves. And that idea that, you know, is enacted in these kind of, this campaign of sabotage on Jersey was not this kind of insurrection of the self was not new for her. She had been developing this idea for a long time in her literary work and activist work. And so I think it would be helpful to go back, you know, born 1894, Lucy Schwab, and she was these early literary beginnings, including her book that was eventually published in 1930, Disavowals. That's the English translation of the French, which I hope you'll explain some of the play on words that was happening there and what happens in the translation. But that she had been working on throughout the 1920s and was a literary corollary to these images, right, of sort of the self that wasn't able to be pinned down, that had the possibility for transformation, was shifting and created this non-cohesive self-image. And if you could sort of talk about that early work and what her contribution was in the literary landscape at that time.
Sure. I think so she's born in 1894. Her father is Maurice Schwab, and her uncle is Marcel Schwab. Is anyone familiar with Marcel Schwab? Big symbolist writer. He was how to put it, kind of like a literary bigwig at the time. So she had access throughout her entire youth. She had access to all of the books of Marcel Schwab. She had access to all of his intellectual connections. At some point, I think she's probably 20, she goes over to report on the scandalous trial of Oscar Wilde, right? So she's in that scene, she knows what's going on there. So she has in some way kind of a charmed upbringing where she's in the middle of like the kind of French cultural scene. Then she meets her partner, Suzanne Malherbe, who was discussed tonight, and they moved to Paris, I believe, in 1918, and immediately she starts to move around the different kind of worlds that are in Paris in 1918, kind of that rich left bank scene. Over here's Hemingway, and then there's James Joyce, and on and on. And she moves between them. This whole time she starts to formulate this idea that normally you might think of writing or art as representational, or it reproduces the world in some way. A painting of an apple is supposed to like the apple, right? Or it might be imaginative or fun, right? You read a novel or a piece of literature to have a good time or to forget. She develops in the 20s this new idea that art can be transformative, that art can be a way to transform oneself and others, that art doesn't have to be representational or even pleasurable, but it can be a way for someone to investigate their own, how does she put it, kind of inner content, right? Kind of explore, she calls it the invisible adventure, the interior adventure, that a work of art can be a way to explore ourselves. It doesn't have to represent anything real, and it doesn't have to even tell a story, but it can be a kind of way to rethink who we are. And that idea stays constant for her entire life from that point on. Because in her Nazi propaganda work, she's trying to figure out how to make the Nazis become different. How can she provoke them into wanting to become different? And it's interesting that in the Nazi propaganda stuff, she makes a distinction between Nazis and Germans. A Nazi is just a German gone bad. So she always imagines that any Nazi can revert or be called back to being a German, which is an interesting idea. But that, like you said, or like you were asking, that idea of transformative writing runs through everything from the 20s, the 30s, the 40s until her death, for sure. And as you can see, all these portraits kind of, what is she doing here? She's not representing herself as she really is. She's projecting a new Cahun and trying to live it out.
Which is, I was sort of suggesting that's like the visual corollary to what she's doing in Disavowals. Can you talk more about not just this, well, I think the notion of the form itself of that book is very much this play between, well, she's playing with the form, but within the form she's playing with, like you just said, where do you locate the real I in that? Is there one, and this mutability?
Yeah, so she writes this work that in English is called Disavowals. And I think it's important to talk a little bit about how it came about. So it's in the middle of the 20s, and she's friends with Sylvia Beach and Adrienne Monnier. Are these names familiar to anybody? Sylvia Beach had the famous bookshop Shakespeare and Company. Sylvia Beach and Adrienne Monnier were also involved with publishing James Joyce's first novel, Serially, and then later actually had to defend Joyce when it came time for the censorship trial. And they were both lesbians, and Cahun obviously is as well. And they had asked Cahun to write a confession, so kind of like a juicy tell-all, basically, right? Like, so Adrienne Monnier and Sylvia Beach approach Cahun and say, spill the dirt, like we love it, gossip, 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 right? And Cahun is like, hell no. Absolutely not, it's my life, right? But she says, I'll write you something, like an anti-biography or an anti-autobiography. So the work includes her long novel, oh, it's over there, sorry, it's on the chair, I keep looking around at the floor for that reason. The work includes autobiographical extracts and letters, but it's also intermingled or mixed with confessions that aren't hers. And it's hard to tell in reading, it's impossible to tell in reading it, in fact, which is which. So she's mixing or intermingling her own life story, but also inventing life stories into this kind of dispersed subject. But for sure, that book, I think, kind of sums up this whole period. The book was released like about a year after this, in 1930. So she'd been experimenting with this idea of self-transformation for at least a decade by that point.
Yeah, this idea that the form of the book itself defies categorization, and I love that aspect too. So you mentioned Cahun and her sexuality, and I think it's important to kind of stay there for a second in terms of the context that we're talking 1920s, 1930s Paris. And that she was early on writing for the first gay publications in France, Inversions and Friendship. And in some of our conversations for tonight, you had been telling me about how Cahun was different than these other, or approached her sexuality differently in a social and public way than these other women, lesbian writers at the time. And I think it's important to kind of signal that and play that out for us here, and also like the context of this new modern woman, how sexuality was kind of understood or pathologized or whatever. It was kind of what was happening with it at that time to kind of understand what she was doing in contestation to it.
Yeah, I would say, so one thing, are we familiar with Gertrude Stein? And you know her partner Alice B. Toklas, the very first wheat browning recipe ever. You know, the Alice B. Toklas cookbook it is, it's Seattle, I don't know, I assume you know that. So she knows Gertrude Stein, and in Gertrude Stein's Making of Americans, she mentions in a kind of, how would you put it, offhand way, I meant the little niece of Marcel Schwab, right? So she knows Cahun. And Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas, or Natalie Barnay, some of these other famous kind of Parisian lesbians at the time, I think the big difference is Cahun is out and loud about it. And she's the only one who's trying to actually do some kind of homosexual activism. So, as Nina said, Cahun is actually involved, and her partner were involved in the very first gay magazines in France as writers and editors. And this is brand new research that has just come to light, so I'm super pumped about it. But yeah, so I think the main thing is she's an activist about it. It's something that she thinks not only is, it's not only something she wants to be in private in the salon world of Paris, but she actually wants to go out and kind of proselytize and argue for homosexual rights. I think that sets her apart, is being willing to put her, in some way, reputation on the line for that, you know.
And so this is sort of a little bit of a transition, but I think related, is thinking about how by the, after Disavowals comes out, after she's been contributing to these publications, she falls in with the Surrealist. I think meeting Andre Breton in 1932, who is one of the kind of leaders of the Surrealist movement. And they're not well known for, or at least the literature today doesn't frame them as being fans of women, right? And but yet Breton basically waxes poetic about Cahun and her contributions to their revolutionary cause, saying, I consider you one of the most curious spirits among 4 or 5 of our times. And curious here is a good thing. And so this is out of step with what we typically think of the Surrealist MO. So I think it would be, I'd like you to kind of talk more, tell us why Cahun's writing invited such praise from Breton and how she was synthesizing their vision. And this is when Surrealism is very linked with the revolution against the fascist rise that was happening across Europe. So there's this link between the potential of literary practice and revolutionary politics, and how Cahun and what she was doing in Disavowals kind of moves into this space of articulating what the Surrealists were after.
Sure. So she publishes Disavowals in 1930, and then, as she puts it later in her diaries, it was met with absolutely deafening silence. That everything she had tried to accomplish in that was completely unheard. And it's interesting that I like the phraseology that she fell in with them. Actually, the story of how they met is interesting. So she had known about Breton and the Surrealists since, she had known about them before they were actually Surrealists in 1918. And she'd been approached in 1918 when she's at the bookshop by one of the proto-Surrealists and asked, do you want to collaborate with us on the journal Literature? Or Literature is one of the first Surrealist journals. And she says, I excused myself, alleging my incompetence and my timidity. So she was too shy. That's what she tells us. So in 1930, she publishes her work. It's met with deafening silence. And she's like, who do I need to work with, or what project is closest to my own? And she actually sets up the meeting with Breton through an intermediary, and she gives Breton the copy of the book. And that's after he reads it, he reads it in a couple of days and sends her that statement that you just said, I think you're one of the most curious spirits out of 4 or 5 of our time. So actually, Cahun is hiring Breton. You know what I mean? Breton doesn't find her, she seeks out Breton and says, I like what you're doing with this kind of détente between surrealism and radical politics. That's the closest thing to what I'm trying to do. She sees a resonance between those two. And then to answer your question, so how does that square with what we normally think of as surrealism's kind of misogyny? I don't know how to answer that really. I don't know. I think there's also, if you read some of the documents, some of the other surrealists are super suspicious of Cahun. They're like, who is this person? She's got a shaved head, God forbid, right? That's not what we're trying to do. And Breton constantly defends her and says, she's way ahead of all of you. You know?
So was the text that she ends up coming out with of Place Your Bets, which is also one of a couple possible translations for this two-part text, where she's articulating kind of the role of artistic practice, literary writing in this revolution. Kind of the space where she concretizes with Breton, like her value to their movement. Was that the kind of
Yeah.
So maybe,
Yeah.
so in Place Your Bets, this is where it gets really kind of, she really starts articulating the role of the reader. And I'm really interested in that, and like how that starts framing her contribution differently too.
Yeah, so by 1932, Cahun and the Surrealists have joined, it's in your program if you want to follow along with the chronology, the Association of Revolutionary Artists and Writers. And there, that surrealism, and that association is an organ of the French Communist Party, who is taking orders from Russia, right? And so this is also the beginning of that kind of Soviet realist style, and the orders coming down from on high are basically collect all the revolutionary writers and artists, and let's make them basically Soviet realists, so that they're just straightforward propagandists. And one of the key surrealists, Louis Aragon, becomes like the factotum of the Soviet propaganda machine and starts to say to everybody and to the surrealists, give it up, that the best kind of poetry best kind of political poetry is straightforward. It tells people what to do. And this idea absolutely enrages Cahun, right? And so she says, no, good poetry or good political poetry will suggest ways of being to the person, but let them kind of fill in the blanks. It's a magical shortcut or a short circuit. It has to be the reader that completes the work. Because if you don't let the reader complete the work, you're just telling them what to do, and how is that any different from being a fascist? Yeah. Right, so like, how do you open them up? Ooh, that was good, huh?
I love this, so I wrote this down where Aragon kind of poses this question, for whom do you write? And this is gonna be Cahun kind of responding back, where it's like, that's clearly like the wrong question, but it's more that I write or want to write against myself. And at the end of the day, the person or group of people you choose to address is of little importance. It's like a remedy, a poison you carefully prepared for someone near you, which might kill or cure an unknown person on the other side of the world. Which I just love. But to your point, right, like that possibility of opening up the reader, which then becomes the Nazi soldier who comes across this piece of paper in their pocket that's delivering a message, is leaving the possibility in that reader to find something in there that's transformative for them.
Yeah, I think a big part of her approach is that it tries to engage the emotions of the reader, not their rational kind of thought process. Because Aragon had said, just be direct, basically. And Cahun says, no, what actually gets people to change is not coming in through the front door, but sneaking in the back door, she puts it, their emotions or their sensibility. And it's also not the positive emotions she provokes with the Nazis, right? So another example of her propaganda stuff, she would write a little tract that would just say, imagine that your wife is dead and your home is on fire. But, it doesn't tell them what to do. And then I'll imagine you're a Nazi soldier, and especially by the end of the war, right, and probably not the top, it's whoever they can find. And you come home, you finally take off everything, and you reach in your pocket, and somehow there's that. What would you do? Who would you think it was? And then, of course, if it's late at night, you might start thinking, shit, what if my house is on fire, right? That's her whole idea of kind of sneaking in the back and allowing the reader to complete the piece. But there's not one completion, that the piece is suggestive. It kind of opens up onto a manifold of possible ways to understand it. And I think in that way, she is trying to honor the reader, and even the Nazis in some way, or honoring the German inside, letting them complete it. You know what I mean? Which is,
and you described it in the passage as having a momentary pause
Mhm.
of like that in and of itself is can be a success.
Yeah, even just a small break in their normal routine, or a small break, or a small rupture in their normal ways of feeling. Just like just a one moment to be like, should I be doing this? Just even that can be enough.
And then repeated.
Everywhere, all the time, yeah.
So that I want to make sure we have time for some questions. But let's just, get to Jersey. She and Suzanne moved there permanently in 1938. There's this growing sort of fascist threat in Paris. And the performance kind of really did a beautiful job of, pacing out that time there and what she was doing. But I'm interested in understanding what this work that they were doing, if there's evidence of or examples of other people doing something similar or of comparable, that's comparable in this poetic sort of way that keeps the indirect rather than direct kind of strategies.
Right.
Or if Cahun and Suzanne in the Nameless Soldiers is really, in your research to date, something that's really sort of set apart.
That one. No, for sure. I'm playing. But yes, I think theirs is the most systematic, it is the most comprehensive, it is absolutely the most thought out. And they even continue when they're in the prison. They get arrested and they're not like, okay, that didn't work. They just keep it up. There are what I do see in the research is that most people, for whatever reason, abandon their artistic commitments when push came to shove. So even some modernist writers like Camus, famously writes The Stranger, which you might have had to read in high school or been forced to, right? Something like that. Camus gives up, at least for a moment, or puts on pause his own aesthetic, and he starts writing just very straightforward kind of anti-Nazi things. I think he's in the basement of the Natural History Museum in Paris working the print, the printer for the resistance paper combat. But I don't, as far as I know, and God knows I don't know much, but as far as I can tell, there isn't something so systematic and willing to put their bodies directly on the line. Because it's also unclear from the performance, but if you read my work, you'll learn this. Their little house, La Rucas, or the farm that they're at the end, is directly across from the soldiers' housing. And right behind them is the military cemetery that the Germans had kind of taken over, and then next to them is the church. So they're in this hive. That's where they are, and even there. And they say later, it's the perfect place. Who would suspect two little old women? And so they say that's actually maybe one reason they were able to do it for so long.
And their house was examined once, right? And materials weren't discovered?
Yeah, actually, I think it was in 42 or 43, the house was requisitioned. So they still live there, but the Nazis start, for instance, putting up their horses in the stable. And so they're right there.
Right, in their living space.
Yeah. And so Cahun had worked out the system where she's able to listen into the radio late at night, and she's got an ottoman that has the typewriter in it. And so she's able to, and the radio, so she's able at night to pull it out, listen to it, type it up, put everything back, while the Nazis might be in the kitchen making dinner. Right? She's just doing it as quietly as possible, which is just fucking amazing. Sorry. But right?
And so they're released in 1945, and Cahun lives for another 10?
9 years?
Okay,
I think, yeah.
9-10 years.
Yeah.
She's doing a lot of reflecting in those 10 years about the time that she's during the occupation and during their imprisonment. What kind of understanding does she take away of her own work and that experience?
She spends 9 years, I think, realizing that she was right all along in some way.
Yeah.
And also after she's released, so she's sentenced to death. Obviously, she makes it. If that wasn't clear, she survives barely because the war ends. And then so she spends 9 years just thinking obsessively back on it. But she also then, by that point, has the benefit of other accounts that have come out. Because Jersey is definitively captured by the Nazis on July 1st, 1940. And from that point on, islanders aren't allowed to have radios. All of the information the islanders are getting is already very filtered. So it's only after her release and she's reading other books that she realizes there was such a thing like the Holocaust or the depth of the concentration camps, you know. But for her, that just kind of completes the picture, it fills it out. But she wasn't shocked that the Nazis were even more horrible than she thought, right? So it allows her just to get more of a kind of bird's eye view of the whole thing, because she's in it for 4 years. And then the last 9 years of her life, it's her slowly pulling back and kind of taking in the whole picture. But she says, she said at one point in her later journals, in Place Your Bets, I had kind of definitively taken down Aragon and that kind of bad poetry, or bad propaganda. She says, I never had really answered the question of what good propaganda should look like. And then she says, on Jersey, I did. You know, so, yeah. But she doesn't write anything else poetic or imaginative really in those 9 years. It's almost all truly biographical. It's interesting that by the end of her life, she's gone from disavowals to she almost returns to this kind of transfigured history. She's found a way to blend them in some way. That the history that she's lived through, she's now transfigured in her own eyes. She's the spiritual sharpshooter of Jersey. She's able to see it she's able to see it through all of her work. I don't know if that makes sense, but she's able to almost
Do you see how the later work is actually in the earlier work? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, she's able to see how her resistance movement was a recasting or a remolding of everything. Yeah. So it was like her final work.
Yeah.
It was like a 4-year-long, really fucking badass performance art piece.
Good propaganda.
Yeah, that's the good propaganda.
So on good propaganda, which we'll all take with us tonight, I want to open it up for questions to Ryan about Cahun, her contributions. Yeah, we've got another 10 minutes. So does anyone have questions? Yes.
Sort of 2 parts. Are you continuing your research currently? And if so, what is the most new and exciting that's turning you on about the work?
So when I read the dissertation, it was mainly from the 20s up until the Nameless Soldiers. And it was also I had to finish. So when we end here, I'm in the ruined farm, I am free. After that line of my dissertation, I'm like, this is where I leave Cahun. I gotta graduate. Right? So yes, I am. So I want to fill out the rest of her life. I think it is important to spend some time writing and thinking about her final reflections. And fill out the beginning, because the story, at least my story, kind of starts in 1926, and she's already in her 30s. Mysteriously, she disappears. So the main part that I'm excited about is finding out that she in fact was not the first female writer in a gay magazine, first writer in a gay magazine, and editor of the first gay magazine in France. That she in the 20s is arguing she's basically a pioneer of the homosexual emancipation movement, which in the United States doesn't really kick off for another 30, 40, 50 years. So that's what's exciting me about it for sure, yeah. To add another, she's already a poet and freedom fighter, and on, to add another couple things on her CV for all of us, for sure.
Anybody else?
Roxy.
There isn't really, I don't think there's a specific answer I'm looking for, but obviously we're in kind of a similar political climate right now. So how can we take things that Cahun did and then kind of translate it into our own society with the mass amount of social media and just media everywhere surrounding us at all times?
If you want a really honest answer, Roxy's one of the best students I've ever had, and we talked about Cahun in our class. An honest answer is I wish I knew. Sorry. I mean, I think for me, because we had talked about what if this very question came up, and I was like, I don't know what to say. But for me, actually, just having her as a heroine, having her as a symbol and an icon, in the stars of my sky, that at least gives me something. And I think for Cahun, you got to figure out what to do with her. You got to put your own powers into play. I think that would be the best way to honor what she's doing. But I don't have a good answer for you, but I have that. Sure. Yes.
I have a question about Suzanne. what you learned about her and their relationship.
Their relationship is one of the greats for the ages. They meet, I think, when they're 14 or 15. And actually in Disavowals, Cahun preserves an account of their first meeting from when they're that young. And Cahun had totally plotted it. You know, she's like, I see this beautiful woman every day, she's in the flower garden, and she like kind of lists what she's gonna do. And she actually gets Suzanne to commit to just 1 year of being her friend. And she's like, I know if I can get 1 year with her, she'll love me forever. And they stay together. That's what she does. There's a million ways to love Cahun. But they spend the rest of their lives absolutely working hand in hand together until Cahun dies. You know, and Malherbe is a little bit hardier in her constitution and lives, I think, another 20 years until the 70s. But just as a quiet, just a quiet old lady in that old house. And intentionally so, you know, Suzanne just kind of hangs out. And then when she dies, that's actually how Cahun came back to us. When Suzanne dies, by that point in the 70s, Cahun had been all but forgotten. And then there's actually an auction of the house's contents. This is a fascinating story. There's an auction of the house contents, and it just goes up for sale in the middle of Jersey because Suzanne didn't leave anything to anybody. Like, all they had in the world were each other, right? And so at the auction house, someone's going to clean up the lot, and they tip over a box, and out spills like an original Dolly, just like in the trash, right? And someone's like, who the hell was this? And then actually, if anyone's familiar with the art historian John Berger, Ways of Seeing, he had been there bidding on that lot and actually lost it to somebody else for $20. So somebody bought like all of Cahun and Malherbe's stuff for $20. Had no idea what it was, and the person who bought it had no clue. It was just like, I think he actually was literally trying to buy the kitchen pots and pans, and everything else came with it. They're like, well, do you just want this box of shit? You know, and he's like, sure. And so he actually keeps it in his attic for years until someone recognizes, oh my God, that's an original drawing by Henri Michaud or something, and gets a hold of an art historian who flies into Jersey, and as the art historian puts it, just spends days plunging through these moldy boxes, and he's like, holy fuck. This is like the biggest thing, and no one knows about it. And that's actually how Cahun came back, because he found these portraits, and I think he linked up with Virginia Zabriskie, a famous gallerist in New York in the 80s, and was like, you need to check this out. Yeah. So it's amazing to think that for so long, all of this stuff was just in a box in an attic in Jersey, which makes me think, you know, like, what's out there, you know? So yeah, but they were inseparable. Cahun will call Malherbe the other me. She calls their relationship a narcissism for two. You know, like drowning in the mirror of one another, right? She means that in a good way, not a creepy way. But, yeah.
And Suzanne was taking these photographs too. That's something that we
Yes.
don't often
Yes.
get credited.
Yeah, it's funny that all these, so I think by now it's cycled through all of them, up through the 40s, is it back again? Yeah. It's funny that these photographs, when they're found, because they are striking, these were never made for exhibition. These were only made as a little personal project between Suzanne and Cahun. They were just like a little fun hobby, basically. So it's funny that these very intimate, just kind of fun, almost like fun selfies for each other, right? Where like, that's like Cahun is this undiscovered photographer. Cahun ain't taking these pictures, her head's in the glass. Like who's clicking the camera? It's Suzanne. Suzanne is the photographer of all of Cahun's self-portraits. I don't even know what the question was. I don't know if that's a question. Yeah.
I'm curious if you, why that is.
Why? What is?
Why Suzanne gets, why it isn't seen as a partnership in photography and why it's...
Sure, why Suzanne gets edited out.
Yeah.
I think because when these, even now I think this is still true, but especially in the 80s and 90s when this is out, we still have this myth of the artist as singular genius. You know what I mean? Like even collaboration is still to this day kind of downgraded as opposed to like the singular genius making his singular or her singular work of art. So I think it's easier to fit this in an art historical narrative if it's just a genius doing her genius thing. And it's like, who are you going to accredit these to as well, kind of pragmatic sense? You know, it's easier to have a Claude Cahun show than it is I'm not saying this is correct, obviously, but this idea that art history loves these singular geniuses. where Cahun's whole project is nothing but collaboration taken to like a meta level, collaborating with her partner, collaborating with the Nazis, collaborating with Breton. She'll say the collaboration of the reader or the other is indispensable, and that's a phrase she repeats in almost all of her writings. I don't know the actual reason, I'm just going off here, but yeah, I would say that would be my impression. Yeah.
I don't actually know like the historical context of gender during this time, but it seems to be that there's like a lot of gender play and a lot of this photography, and I was wondering if you could speak to that and whether that's in any of her writing and
Sure.
visual play.
Yeah, I think when these pictures came back, so these pictures were really exhibited at the end of the 80s and the early 90s, which is the exact same time that Judith Butler, you know what I'm talking about? Gender trouble, Judy, you know? Like, that's when her theories about gender as performance and drag were also becoming huge in the American Academy. And so that's, I think, one reason, if you want to put it this way, why Cahun blew up at the time, because here was a perfect forerunner example of gender as drag or performance. Does that make sense? Cahun herself, I don't think she doesn't necessarily see it through a gendered frame as much as it's her trying on as many identities as she wants, some of which might be male and some of which might be female, or androgynous, or hermaphroditic, or any number of ways you can imagine these combinations. But I think for her, yeah, I think it's for her almost inhabiting characters. Like she almost steps into the mise en scène of a totally different self, you know? How explicit is she about the gender play? Not very. For her, it's much more about just a completely different identity. Yeah, but she's not thinking in those frames, I would say. That's not her own self-interpretation. Yeah. Yeah.
Did she play with identity and writing in the same way? Or?
Did she? Yeah, this book that we referenced, Disavowals, totally worth checking out. That's her where she is threading real stuff from her life, fake stuff from her life, stuff from history that she's acting like it's her own life. And they scroll through here, when you see those photo montages, those are from the book. And actually, Suzanne, to return to that question, had made all those photo montages. Yeah. So Cahun had maybe made some plans for them, but Suzanne's actually the one cutting and photographing, gluing, etc. Yeah, I would say in that book is the only place you find it. Yeah. And I think that's her only work that's available translated into English, her own work. In the back, yeah?
Do you think that reading it in French is, do you think learning French is worth it? I wondered because
For
I
her?
read it in English and some of it's like, I wonder about like wordplay and like.
Yeah, there is absolutely that whole poetic dimension of her writing that, as someone who learned French very recently, or I should say late in life, is absolutely lost on me. You know, I'm sure reading it is much more beautiful in French. Yeah, I would say that there is a lot there, especially after she meets the Surrealists who are so much involved in this kind of play of words and language, trying to get to something else, yes. But she doesn't, you know, it's funny. She writes Disavowals, and then she writes this Place Your Bets, this little pamphlet about poetry and its place in politics. And she only writes in her life, as far as I know, a handful of poems. So it's really interesting that she goes on and on about poetry's place in revolution, and then she herself only creates a handful. She's certainly active in a lot of other things, but she almost leaves poetry for the poets in some way. But I'm sure it's much more beautiful in French. That makes sense, French is beautiful. Yeah.
So with her photographs, or these photographs of Suzanne taking them, being discovered and her writings being preserved, has there been any other works of hers that have been found, like propaganda or anything like this?
Yeah, a lot of the propaganda has been preserved. There's two places in the world where all of Cahun's stuff is, that remains. There's Yale, the archive at Yale, and then there's one on Jersey itself. And actually, the Jersey archive is available for viewing online. So get out there, get on it. All the propaganda is there. I think you have to pay like $10 a month because they need the help. It's a small archive on Jersey. You know what I mean? It's on the map, Jesus. But so, yeah, you can see all of that online, or at least half of it online. The Yale archive, of course, they just went there this summer. It's like they lock you in, and they lock you in, they do like a radiation scan. Like it's hard to get into, right? I mean, anyone can go, but it's hard to actually have fun there. But anyone can see the stuff on the Jersey archive. Yeah. So all the propaganda is preserved. A lot of it is preserved there in its actual original, because it's cool to see it, because it's she's using like a lot of it's cigarette papers, like rolling papers, right? And that's where she's writing a lot of this stuff, because you can crumple it up, toss it aside, toss it in someone's backpack, just to see the actual materiality of it's really cool.
Yeah, can you talk, that was something I actually wanted to talk about, because I'm so fascinated by the materiality of these things, and like how one would both experience the words, but like the actual felt quality of like being with the thing. Can you, so cigarette papers, what else, like?
Coins. So there was a little boardwalk at amusement park on St. Helier.
Yeah.
And so she would take a lot of coins and just scratch into them down the bore and things like that, and then load them into the coin return. So soldiers, and that's also part of it too, it's also the whole mise en scène of finding the coin, you know what I mean? It's not just the thing, but the context of the thing. So the German soldiers are finally getting off work, they're gonna go play a damn game, and then, they get their change back and it says down with 4, So the object itself might not be that impressive. Certainly I would even hesitate to call that an art object in some way, but the material of it in the hand of the soldier just freaks him out. Who did that? Where is it coming from? How's it coming from that machine?
It can be found like in your pocket, or you have no idea how it got there.
And those objects, I would like to say this, that those objects, the whole point of them is you can't tell who they come from. Like the artist has been almost completely deleted from the actual object. So by the time you have a cigarette paper or a coin or her installation where she says, Jesus is great, but Hitler is greater because men died for Jesus, or because Jesus died for men, but men died for Hitler. Just that object though, the artist is gone. There's no fingerprint of an individual unique artist there. So it's almost like, to use a metaphor that I think would be apropos, it's like a landmine. It's an object that is sent out into the world that no longer requires the person who made it and has its own kind of internal consistency, or it's like a little machine that will do work by itself. A complete lack of craft is interesting to me about these
So the
things
ones
too.
that are preserved in these archives were like, where are they coming from? Like how are they being preserved? Like did the Nazi keep them? Did they destroy them?
Cahun was able to hide some of them.
Okay.
Yeah. So and they also would make copies of them after they were released. Like they had remembered what they had done and said. They were able to make carbon copies and that kind of stuff. They were able to hide some originals in some of the books of their library that weren't burned. So like the Nazis burned most of their library, but like they didn't touch the cookbooks in the kitchen, say. You know what I mean? And so before they were put in prison, they're cramming things in the books that aren't going to be burned so that they can retrieve them and have some account later. Yeah. But she says that she probably made, I think she says, between 4,000 and 7,000 pieces of propaganda in that 4-year time span. So 4 years, say about 350 days. I know that's not right, but bad math. So it's about 1,400 days and 7,000 pieces of propaganda, 6 or 7 a day that they're going out making, etc. So they were working. Yeah.
One more.
Sure.
Oh, is there any record that's been found of the effect on the Nazi soldier?
I'm sorry, could you say it again?
Is there any record that's been found, either in the trial or anything else, of their effect on the Nazi soldiers?
Yeah, there's one that Cahun kind of homes in on. So when she's in prison, she meets this German soldier, ex-German soldier by that point. He's in prison with her, Kurt Gunther. And there's a line that was quoted in the performance earlier. He says, or Cahun writes, our phantom, talking about the Nameless Soldier, and our being her and Suzanne, she says, our phantom has been incarnated in men unknown to us. And actually the rest of the quotation is, and also in Kurt Gunther, right? I just cut that because it's not so poetic. But so she's in prison, and one of the people next to them, he's like, yeah, I found this stuff from the Nameless Soldier, and I was like, fuck this war. And then here I am. And so she at least has that one piece that absolutely confirmed kill. You know what I mean? Sorry to use that language, but I think it's kind of funny. That you kill somebody by making them empathetic. You kill a Nazi by making them an empathetic German. So yes, she does have one clear example who she's with in prison, and he's like, oh my God, that was you? She's like, yep. I love that move in the dance.
Yeah.
Oh, that dance is fucking incredible. Awesome. So good.
That's 3 minutes.
Yeah. anybody wants to read it, get a hold of me. It's not published yet, it's still got some work to do, but if you want to read the story that this is coming from, gladly share it, on the condition that you let me take you out for a cup of coffee after you read it. I want to know what you think, and I want to know how to change it, how to make it better. Because I think this story, I think we need this now. I need this now. You know what I mean? And I want to make sure that when it does come out as a book, that it's readable by the most people possible. You know, I feel like a publicist right now. But she fucking needs it, and we need it. Okay, I'll leave it.